The United States is headed for a financial disaster, maybe the biggest since World War II. And Washington, it seems so distracted by political fighting, they barely notice this. Like $35 trillion ticking time bomb.
It's a stark way to put it, but yeah, pretty accurate based on the numbers. We're looking at a fiscal crisis that seems to be coming faster than, well, certainly faster than policymakers are admitting.
Right. Driven by spending, borrowing.
Exactly. Runaway mandatory spending, a lot of borrowing, and just, well, a real reluctance to think long-term.
Okay, so that's our mission today. We're going deep into these, let's call them grim financial truths. We'll unpack the cost of all this political gridlock, look at what's really driving the debt, and then
we dig into the conservative blueprint that's been proposed, the one aiming to pull things back from the edge by, cutting spending pretty significantly.
let's start with the immediate stuff, the headlines. This constant threat of a government shutdown seems like it's almost background noise now.
It does feel that way sometimes. Congress just keeps barreling toward the brink. It creates a lot of uncertainty.
And it's expensive. It's not just drama. Our sources point out 14 potential shutdowns since '81. Just 3 recent ones cost taxpayers about $4 billion.
That's right. And the 2018-19 shutdown, that hit the GDP for an estimated $11 billion. It's like we're shooting ourselves in the foot, financially speaking.
But you said earlier this is kind of a smokescreen.
In a way, yeah. It distracts from the much, much bigger issue. The underlying deficit. Forget the official spin sometimes. The actual deficit in 2023 was closer to $2 trillion.
$2 trillion.
Yeah, about 7.4% of GDP. And to give you some context, I mean, outside of World War II, or the absolute peak of the 2008 financial crisis, that's the biggest deficit we've seen since the Great Depression.
Wow. So we're running like wartime deficits without a major war or crash.
Essentially, yes. Peacetime, relatively speaking, but with emergency-level borrowing.
And what's that doing to the overall debt level?
Well, the consequences are piling up fast. The debt is projected to hit its highest level ever compared to the size of the economy within just 4 years. And here's a really startling fact. Interest payments. The money we pay just on the interest on our debt, that's projected to be more than the entire defense budget this year.
Wait, say that again? More than defense.
More than we spend on national defense. We're paying more to service the debt, basically to bondholders, than to fund the military. That's a massive shift in priorities that nobody really voted for.
Okay, that perfectly tees up our first big topic from the sources. This debt tsunami, the scale. $35 trillion.
It's a huge number. And it means our debt-to-GDP ratio is the highest it's been since right after World War II. But honestly, it's the future projections that are really alarming.
What do those look like?
The CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, they estimate that if we just stay on the current path, annual deficits will hit $2.6 trillion a year by 2034.
So we're basically on track to add another $20 trillion to the debt in just the next 10 years.
If policies don't change, yes. That's the trajectory. And it's crucial to understand why. The sources are really clear on this.
What's the main driver?
About 90% of the spending growth over the next decade. It's mandatory spending, specifically Social Security and Medicare. These programs grow automatically because of demographics, the aging population. They're outside the usual budget fights.
And the trust funds for those programs, they're in trouble.
I should have read, yeah. The Medicare Hospital Insurance Fund, they say, faces insolvency by 2036. Social Security's main fund. By 2033.
Insolvency doesn't mean they just disappear, though.
No, not completely.
Yeah.
But it means they can't pay out 100% of the promised benefits. So inaction basically guarantees huge automatic cuts down the line for retirees. It's why even Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said the path is, quote, completely unsustainable.
I saw something interesting in the source material about economic forecasting models.
Ah, right. The long-term growth models. It's fascinating, actually. They often just... They break, they crash, unless the economists plug in an assumption that politicians will eventually cut the deficit.
So the math itself tells us the current path doesn't work.
Pretty much. It's like a warning embedded in the data. If you assume we keep doing what we're doing, the economic models just don't compute long term.
And that was all based on low interest rates. Which brings us to financial truth number 2. Higher borrowing costs are speeding everything up right now.
Exactly. For years, there was this, maybe a fantasy, that debt was almost free because rates were so low. That party is definitely over.
What changed?
Well, the Fed hiked rates to fight inflation. And the yield on the 10-year Treasury, a key benchmark, hit 5% back in October 2023. That's, what, 75% higher than the average we saw just a few years ago in the late 2010s?
And that rate hike triggers this refinancing time bomb. Explain that.
Okay, Think of it like this. The government constantly issues bonds, like IOUs, that mature after a certain time. When they mature, the government has to pay them back, usually by issuing new bonds at whatever the current interest rate is.
Rolling over the debt.
Precisely. And here's the kicker. More than half of the $26 trillion in debt held by the public at the end of 2023, it needs to be refinanced, rolled over within the next 3 years.
At these new higher rates.
Very likely, yes. So we're not just facing higher interest costs gradually, we're locking them in relatively quickly as old, cheaper debt matures. That means the cost of servicing the debt jumps up much faster than people expected.
So if you had a huge credit card balance at 2% and suddenly you have to move it to a card charging 5%, your payments shoot up immediately.
That's a good analogy, yeah.
Yeah.
It makes the problem much more urgent.
And the sheer amount of debt itself, does that hurt the economy, slow things down?
Oh, absolutely. There's a strong link in economic studies between high government debt and slower economic growth over the long run.
Is there like a danger level?
Research suggests that once debt gets above around 80% of GDP, it starts to become actively harmful to growth. And the U.S., we're already way past that.
How much slower?
Well, studies show countries with debt over 90% of GDP tend to grow about a full percentage point slower each year than countries in the, say, 60–90% range. That might not sound like much.
But compounded over years.
Exactly. It means it takes maybe 20 years longer for the next generation to see the economy double in size, all because we didn't control spending today.
Okay, so the problem is huge, it's accelerating, and it's dragging down our future potential. Let's pivot to solutions. The sources detail a specific conservative approach, emphasizing spending cuts over tax hikes. What's the thinking there?
The core idea, based on looking at how other countries have tackled deficits, is that cutting government spending tends to be less damaging to the economy in the medium term, say, over 5 years, than raising taxes.
Why is that?
The argument is that tax hikes tend to stifle work, investment, and productivity, which you need for growth. Spending cuts, if done right, can shrink the government's footprint and potentially be more effective at actually reducing the debt burden long term.
And the specific plan outlined in the sources, this reverse the curse blueprint from the House, it sets some really ambitious goal.
Extremely ambitious, yes. It aims to cut deficit spending by $14 trillion over 10 years. $14 trillion.
Which would lead to a balanced budget.
That's the goal. A balanced budget, maybe even a tiny $44 billion surplus by 2034. And maybe more importantly, it aims to bring that debt-to-GDP ratio down from a projected 131%, which is clearly unsustainable,
Right.
down to around 88% by 2034. Still high historically, but much, much safer.
How do they possibly get to those numbers? It must rely heavily on the economy growing faster.
It does. That's really the linchpin of the whole plan. It assumes that combining spending cuts with pro-growth policies.
Like what?
Things like deregulation, making tax cuts permanent, policies aimed at boosting domestic energy production. They believe these can push annual economic growth up to 3%.
Which is faster than the CBO predicts now.
About 1% faster per year than the CBO baseline. And that faster growth, they calculate, would generate about $3 trillion in deficit reduction on its own, just through higher tax revenues from a bigger economy.
Is 3% growth realistic, though? That seems high.
That's definitely where the debate lies. Critics argue achieving sustained 3% growth is, well, optimistic, especially with an aging population. Supporters say it's possible if the policy mix is right.
Okay, putting the growth debate aside for a second, where do the direct spending cuts come from? The blueprint talks about right-sizing the bloated bureaucracy.
Yeah, the focus is heavily on discretionary spending, that's the part Congress votes on each year, unlike entitlements, and also eliminating programs they label as woke and wasteful.
So specific targets.
They propose setting discretionary spending for next year at about $1.6 trillion, and then capping its growth at just 1% per year after that. That alone generates $2.5 trillion in savings over 10 years on paper.
And the wasteful part, what's on the chopping block there?
A big one is the $80 billion funding increase for the IRS that was passed recently. The argument in the blueprint is the IRS hasn't delivered on the promised revenue from increased enforcement.
How far off were they?
Well, the source notes that in 2023, the extra enforcement funding brought in only about $160 million, when the projection was closer to $2.9 billion, so a huge gap.
Wow. Okay, what else?
They also target what they call green corporate welfare from the Inflation Reduction Act. Those subsidies are expected to cost maybe $870 billion through 2031, potentially more. And then there are changes to social safety nets.
Like what?
Rolling back a recent $300 billion increase in food stamp spending. This came from the administration changing the formula the Thrifty Food Plan used to calculate benefits.
So they changed the math and costs went up.
Essentially, yes. A unilateral change that significantly increased the program's cost baseline. The blueprint also calls for strengthening work requirements for able-bodied adults who receive Medicaid or SNAP food assistance.
Okay, but we keep coming back to it. Entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, they're 90% of the spending growth. What does the blueprint say about the elephant in the room?
This is where, honestly, the blueprint acknowledges it can't be a one-party solution. It calls for creating a bipartisan fiscal commission. Mandatory.
To do what?
To actually sit down and hammer out reforms. The key conditions outlined are protect current beneficiaries, people already retired or close to it.
Right, don't pull the rug out from under them.
Exactly. But then you have to modernize the program so they're financially sound for the long haul. Stop that countdown to 2033 and 2036 when the trust funds run short. It requires bipartisan buy-in to stick.
So let's bring this all together. What does this complex mess of deficits, debt, interest rates, and potential cuts actually mean for you, the listener?
Well, it means this political gridlock we see, it's not just annoying noise on TV, it's actively pushing the country towards one of two really bad outcomes.
Which are?
Either a long, slow economic decline, think stagnation, high interest rates crowding out private investment, fewer opportunities, or potentially a sudden, sharp sovereign debt crisis, like creditors suddenly lose faith and stop lending us money or demand way higher rates.
And the higher rates we're seeing now just speed up that timeline.
Absolutely. That window we had to act, it's shrinking. Experts used to talk about maybe having 2 decades to stabilize the debt relative to GDP. Higher borrowing costs shorten that window significantly.
And if we pass that point,
The models suggest, that beyond a certain point, no realistic combination of tax hikes or spending cuts can prevent either a default, the government just can't pay its bills, or the Fed being forced to just print money to cover the debt.
which leads to massive inflation.
Exactly. An implicit default through inflation.
So that leads us to our final thought. These cuts being debated now, however difficult, there's still choices we can make proactively. The alternative is much worse.
It really is. The alternative is having change forced upon us in an emergency, like the kind of sudden, deep, reactive austerity cuts we saw in Greece. Those aren't planned. They're chaotic and destructive.
So here's the question to leave you with. If our leaders fail to make these tough choices on spending today, and we hit that sudden crisis point, what specific essential government service would you cut first to avoid default? Not just waste, but something core FBI, air traffic control, veteran benefits.
That's the brutal reality of the choice inaction is forcing onto the future. It's something we should all think about.